Terra had become a maze of fire and ruin, a labyrinth carved from the remnants of industrial titans and the ash of human despair. Hives, pyres, clawed toward a sky choked with smoke and faint auroras of unnatural light, each spire a monument to centuries of suffering, devotion, and exploitation. Between them, streets twisted like the veins of a dying beast, clogged with debris, broken servitors, and the shadows of those who had survived the initial purge. Every step I took was a negotiation with death itself. A slab of concrete might conceal a hidden promethium leak, a street turned into a funnel of corpses, the wind carrying the scent of blood, soot, and ozone from overstrained power generators. Each inhalation burned the throat. Each heartbeat was a drum reminding me of the stakes. I moved as one forgotten by the world, a specter among ruins. Yet I was watched. Something deeper than sight followed me, currents of expectation and dread brushing against my consciousness. The hive, for all its decay, throbbed with life of persistence that mocked the Inquisition's belief in order and control. Shadowed corners concealed the remnants of scavenger gangs, desperate priests, children who had learned to survive on fear and scraps of knowledge. Yet within the chaos, whispers grew, first subtle, then insistent, fragments of devotion, tiny flickers of faith that seemed to reach toward me. I felt it in the marrow. These small lights were not random. They were a summons. It was in a collapsed manufactorum, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burned servitors, that I found her. A woman, thin eyes obsidian, her gaze reflecting the flickering promethium fires like molten mirrors. Her hands were scarred and calloused, yet extended toward me as though the world itself demanded we meet. When she spoke, her voice carried through the ruins, not in words, but as a resonance I could feel in my chest. You have survived. Not a greeting, not an invitational acknowledgement of inevitability. I stepped forward, hand brushing hers, and felt the world shift around us. Reality itself seemed to adjust, subtle and almost imperceptible, bending to the insistence of our convergence. The nights that followed became a curriculum in survival and perception. My mentor had taught me the subtle art of the warp, to bend without breaking, to influence without exposing oneself, to endure, even as currents pressed from every direction. This lesson was a negotiation with the impossible. Its shadows moved differently around me. Light pulled from darkness, as if obeying instinct rather than physics. Objects shifted slightly when unobserved. Spurs of futures brushed my consciousness, each leaving impressions like fingerprints on the mind. And each act, however minor, left a toll. Flesh ached, bones tired, thoughts fragmented under the pressure of being both observer and instrument. The hive responded to these currents in ways both horrifying and magnificent. Faith pulsed through the streets, a river of devotion that could not be contained. By the time the Inquisition arrived for the second purge, it was no longer whispers, but a tide, millions strong, pressing toward the heart of Terra with an insistence that challenged reality itself. Hive districts, manufactoria, and spaceports overflowed with pilgrims who had abandoned sustenance, shelter, and reason in their need to witness, to follow, to survive. Each voice joined the next, a single cadence that vibrated in my bones and whispered across the warp. The city had become alive, not as matter alone, but as intention, a collective will made tangible. The first clash with the Inquisition was both terrifying and exquisite. Strike teams descended with bolters and flamers, psychic shields humming against threats unseen. They expected chaos, disorder, mortal fear, but they had misjudged the current they faced. Pilgrims became shields, walls, organisms of coordinated instinct. Streets twisted into maelstroms of fire, screams, and promethium smoke. Bolter fire ignited shrines. Flames danced across spire walls, yet the faithful pressed forward, their insistence bending the currents of the warp in subtle but undeniable ways. A whisper reached me from the chaos. Lead them. Hesitation costs lives, yet even the blood of the fallen fueled the tide, amplifying its energy, feeding the force that pulsed beneath the city. Miracles began to manifest, each more impossible than the last. Children healed from wounds that should have been fatal. Districts once consumed by famine and plague flourished overnight. Flames died before they could spread. Witnesses swore they had seen the emperor walking among the faithful, though each vision was unique, tailored to the observer's longing or fear. The Inquisition faltered, unable to reconcile doctrine with overwhelming evidence. Even some of their most loyal psychers, attuned to the warp, could not process the phenomena. Their minds trembled, caught between awe and terror. Veynar Sol became the fulcrum of this unstoppable force. Carried across the ruins, thin and fragile, eyes reflecting the impossible fires around him, he embodied the collective insistence of the faithful. Each confrontation with the Inquisition tested him, yet he survived. In moments of solitude, he reflected on the morality of his existence, haunted by the death his presence had caused. Still, the tide surged onward, feeding him even as he questioned his own choices. The warp pulsed beneath him, patient, ever present, a subtle reminder that power exacts a price for every use. Terra itself responded. Central hive spires shivered, the sky fractured with aurora-like lights, twisting reality in ways the Arpites could not understand. Within the Imperial palace, the High Lords convened, faces pale beneath masks of authority, voices clashing in fear, panic, and indecision. Each decree fell flat. The tide of devotion had become unstoppable. Even the custodians, silent sentinels of the Emperor, understood that obedience alone could not restrain the force now converging upon the heart of the Imperium. The custodians moved with deliberate grace, parting the faithful, not with force, but presence. Halberds lowered, eyes hidden yet unwavering. They guided Veynar Sol to the steps of the Eternity Gate. The sacrificial voices surged forward, shielding him, insistent on his survival, each soul a brick in the architecture of reality itself. Servitors paused, augmetic limbs trembling. Astropaths fell to their knees, overwhelmed by currents too vast to comprehend. And then the golden throne trembled. A finger moved, a hand twitched. Not enough for mortal eyes to discern, yet enough to ignite hope. Silence fell, heavier than any bolter salvo. Lights danced across hive spires, flames bent backward, wounds closed in silence. The impossible had become manifest. Inquisitors faltered, demons waiting beyond the veil held their pause, and the galaxy itself seemed to shudder. Veynar, hollowed and radiant with the current of the faithful, felt the warp pulse beneath his feet. Custodians lowered halberds in reverence, aware that the balance of the Imperium itself had shifted. The golden throne responded again. The twitch became a ripple, the pulse of life stirring. Terra shimmered as auroras bent across the sky. Shadows recoiled, and the universe seemed to acknowledge the insistence of humanity. Pilgrims fell to their knees, voices raised in unbroken unison, tears streaming, hearts and minds joined as one. For the first time in millennia, humanity's voice had pierced the silence of the Emperor. The Imperium would never be the same. Faith had become tangible, unstoppable, shaping reality itself. Custodians remained vigilant, Inquisition silent, warp currents watching. Veynar Sol stood at the center, a living testament that the universe had listened. Something immense, eternal, and incomprehensible had stirred, and Terra, cradle of mankind, bore witness to the dawn of a new epoch. The underhives were a different world entirely. Sunlight had never touched their corridors, and even the faint glow of failing luminators cast long, twitching shadows across walls, slick with oil, blood, and mold. The air was thick with the stench of rot and chemical residue, carrying the faint hum of machinery so old it was impossible to know whether it still functioned or merely haunted the ruins with the memory of work. Every step was measured. Every sound risked discovery. Rats, mutated and massive, scuttled along support beams, and the echoes of distant screams hinted at the countless souls lost to hunger, disease, and the arbitrary cruelty of hive law. Yet within this darkness, life persisted. Children scavenged, picking through the remains of servitors and debris. Their eyes, too old for their years, reflecting both cunning and desperation. Adults, gaunt and hollow, whispered prayers to gods long forgotten, murmured fragments of faith that seemed to cling to the walls like biofilm. I moved among them, careful, listening to the rhythm of the hive as if it were a heartbeat. The currents of devotion were subtler here, fragmented by years of neglect, yet no less potent. A mother knelt beside her child, pressing a small, makeshift rosarius into the boy's palm, murmuring blessings that the boy repeated with tentative reverence. I felt the warp respond to these gestures, small but undeniable threads of power that curled around me like tendrils. Each act of faith added to the tide, and each act of defiance against the Inquisition strengthened it further. In this place, survival was an act of devotion as much as endurance. The first strike team entered the underhive like a predator, bolters flashing in the gloom, targeting any movement, any sound. Their psychers projected illusions to corral the faithful, projecting terrors into the minds of the desperate. I felt their presences before I saw them, the cold certainty of their intent pressing like iron bands across the psychic currents of the hive. Pilgrims scattered, some screaming, some frozen in awe or terror, while the strike team advanced with mechanical precision. Yet they underestimated the hive itself. Corridors shifted, collapses blocked paths. The walls themselves seemed to guide the faithful toward safety. The warp, subtle and patient, twisted perception, diverting the hunters from the hunted. One child, no older than 10, ran alongside me, clutching a tattered data slate she had found among the debris. Kana, her eyes met mine, wide and unblinking, and I understood instinctively that she was no longer merely a survivor. She was part of the tide. I guided her through a narrow shaft, the walls scraping our shoulders, hearing the thunder of boots echoing behind us. The warp pulsed, responding to our shared insistence, nudging debris, deflecting projectiles, giving us a fraction of a heartbeat more than we should have had. Each moment was a negotiation, each step a battle, won without striking a blow. The strike team's leader, a stern man in black carapace, realized the futility of their forward motion and unleashed a psychic blast, hoping to scatter the pilgrims and force compliance. The air itself seemed to thicken, tendrils of energy searing nerves, twisting perception, making every corridor a labyrinth of fear and vision. Children screamed, adults groaned, and I felt my own mind strain under the pressure. But I reached outward, extending subtle threads of guidance, a fraction of power enough to stabilize the currents. Shadows coalesced around the faithful, bending the perception of the enemy, delaying the psychic assault, giving us room to breathe, to move, to live. Emerging from the underhive into a collapsed courtyard, the scale of the city's devotion became apparent. Tens of thousands had gathered, forming a human river that streamed toward the center of the hive with unstoppable momentum. Each individual was a note in a symphony, each heartbeat a drum, each whispered prayer a chord tying reality itself to our will. Bolters fired into the crowds, yet the faithful pressed forward. Some fell, their bodies feeding the tide, but the living surged onward, driven by something far larger than fear or self-preservation. The custodians arrived then, their golden armor catching the dim light, halberds raised, moving with the inevitability of time itself. They parted the crowd, creating a protective corridor, their presence alone intimidating the strike teams into cautious retreat. Veynar Sol, carried through the faithful, felt the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders. His frail body was a vessel, but it was his mind that carried the currents of hope, fear, and insistence. Each glance, each subtle gesture, each whispered word directed the pilgrims, coordinated the movement of tens of thousands, bending the tide of humanity as if it were a single organism responding to his will. From the upper spires, the Inquisition attempted to reassert control. Skrills screamed with orders, amplified and distorted, threatening doom to those who resisted. Flame projectors and plasma turrets aimed downward, incinerating rubble, melting barricades, yet each destructive act seemed only to galvanize the faithful further. The warp pulsed in response, mirroring the devotion of the masses, creating small miracles. Bridges of debris solidified under feet. Flames died before reaching bodies, and wounds healed with astonishing rapidity. Reality itself began to bend subtly, unnoticeable to the untrained eye, yet undeniable to those who had felt the currents of the warp. In a quiet corner of the hive, I witnessed something extraordinary. An old priest, bent with age and scarred by decades of purges, raised his hands and whispered an ancient litany. The words, lost to time and memory, resonated across the hives, harmonizing with the chants of the sacrificium vocis. The air shimmered, light bending around the faithful, creating illusions of pathways through rubble that did not exist, guiding the living and confounding the enemy. Even the most disciplined psychers faltered, caught between reality and perception, unable to reconcile the impossible manifestations before them. The tide continued to move, each person contributing, each act of faith magnified across the hive. Children carried relics, adults offered their strength, and the infirm lent their prayers. The strike teams retreated under pressure they could not fully understand, haunted by visions of impossible futures and the relentless insistence of millions. Every step forward was both a small victory and a test of endurance, a negotiation between the will of humanity and the chaos of war. And in the midst of it all, Veynar Sol understood the cost. Each exertion of his influence left marks on his mind and body, each miracle a toll exacted. Yet he had no choice. The Imperium's heart was at stake, and the currents of devotion had chosen him as the fulcrum. The faithful, the custodians, the Inquisition, the very warp itself waited for his next move. Each moment was a delicate balance, a thread stretched between survival and annihilation, hope and despair. And yet, through the ruins and chaos, the tide pressed forward, unstoppable, undeniable, shaping the destiny of Terra itself. The city itself seemed to breathe, each hive spire inhaling the prayers and exhaled devotion of millions, pulsing with life beyond mere biology. Streets shifted beneath the tide, debris reformed into pathways as though the city conspired to guide the faithful toward the heart of the hive. The warp shimmered faintly at the edges of perception, a subtle undulation that made the impossible feel inevitable. Bolts of raw psychic energy, long contained by centuries of inquisitorial discipline, now flared in the air, forming twisting arcs of light that seemed almost playful, dancing across rooftops, threading through the faithful. Harmless, yet ominous, children ran through streets where walls had once collapsed, laughing as the debris reassembled itself just enough to allow passage. Adults, their bodies scarred and blackened by flame and frost, moved in unison, instinctively guided by currents of devotion that Veynar Sol could barely comprehend. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, promethium, an incense familiar scents twisted into something new by the warp, heavy and sweet, grounding and alien at once. Miracles happened everywhere. A leprous, gangrened hand healed with startling immediacy. A fire that should have consumed an entire block burned itself out mid-air. Bolts of searing energy from inquisitorial weapons arced harmlessly over praying masses, deflected by forces unseen, as if reality itself had taken sides. High above, inquisitorial psychers projected visions meant to terrify, illusions of monsters in apocalypse meant to scatter the faithful. But the hive had become a living conductor for collective insistence. The visions, twisted and fractured, sometimes amusing, sometimes terrifying, kept always bending around the tide of devotion. Pilgrims stepped through hallucinations as if they were portals, undeterred, and even the most disciplined psychers began to falter. Their minds fraying under the weight of millions of conscious prayers intertwined with warp currents. The city had become a mirror of the mind of humanity itself, resilient, unpredictable, and inexorably alive. Veynar Sol, moving through the river of the faithful, became a nexus for these energies. Each glance he gave, each subtle motion of his hands, guided entire movements, coordinated the currents of thought and prayer into a force tangible and undeniable. The power surged through him, gnawing at his limbs, stretching his consciousness across the hive as if he were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. His own fears, doubt, guilt, and despair entwined with the devotion of the faithful, creating a tension that could tear or create. Every miracle exacted a toll, and yet the cost felt secondary to the pressing necessity of survival. The Inquisition struck again, descending from the upper spires with a disciplined precision. Their psychers, trained for decades in the art of psychic suppression, unleashed volleys of concentrated fear, attempting to fracture the hive's current. The faithful faltered, yet never broke. Children guided by instinct, old men chanting ancient litanies, women carrying relics across rubble, they formed patterns that twisted reality, bending fire, movement, and perception around them. Veynar extended his influence, not forcibly, but as one might steer a river around rocks, subtle, gentle, and inexorable. Even the Inquisition's leaders began to recognize the futility of their attempts, their confidence wavering under the pressure of a devotion too vast to suppress. From the spire tops, a rare light fractured the smog-choked sky. Auroral-like currents of psychic energy, fueled by the insistence of the faithful, created trails of glowing color, like veins of fire coursing through the city. Each color carried its own resonance, touching minds and hearts, healing wounds, inspiring courage, and bolstering resolve. Rumors spread in whispers, even among the inquisitors. The emperor walks among them, they said. Though each witness claimed a different vision, some saw a golden figure whose presence inspired terror and hope simultaneously. Others glimpsed a figure of light and shadow, enigmatic and shifting, whose mere gaze healed the faithful. The custodians, golden and immovable, moved to protect Veynar, forming a corridor through which no strike team could pass. Halberds gleamed in the refracted light, reflecting auroras in impossible angles. Their presence alone created a psychic weight, compressing the reality around them, making ordinary movement for attackers arduous and disorienting. Each custodian acted not merely as warrior, but as stabilizer. They were harmonizing with the currents of devotion, amplifying the influence of the faithful, shaping both perception and reality in subtle but undeniable ways. In a quiet courtyard, a group of pilgrims faced the Inquisition directly, refusing to retreat. Bolter fire struck them, and yet they endured, unflinching, their chants forming harmonic resonance with the warp. Flames licked their robes, yet dissipated before touching skin. One woman, holding a relic of the emperor, radiated such potent insistence that even the most powerful psychers could not project terror against her. Veynar reached out across the psychic currents, reinforcing their resolve, threading subtle guidance through the chaos. Each act of defiance, each miracle, each whispered prayer fed into a lattice of power that bent the battlefield itself to their favor. And then, from the highest spire, an astropath scream cut through the error signal that something impossible was manifesting. A tear in the veil of reality, a subtle warp fracture rippled across the hive. The faithful felt it instinctively, a call, a recognition, a stirring of something eternal. The Inquisition paused, even their psychers, faltering, unsure of how to respond. The currents of the warp, long dormant in this sector, responded to the insistence, weaving miracles into patterns that defied doctrine and logic. The streets became rivers of impossible phenomena. Fires froze midair. Streets seemed to rearrange themselves. Debris formed bridges and passages where none should exist. Pilgrims stepped upon walls as if gravity were optional, guided by currents of devotion too subtle for mortal comprehension. Children played among moving shadows, their laughter echoing through alleys where death should have been certain. The warp had become a canvas, the faithful painters and Veynar Sol the brush guiding every stroke. Every miracle, every bend in reality exacted a toll on him. Fatigue gnawed at his limbs, his mind strained under the weight of so many conscious thoughts, prayers, and fears. Yet he endured because failure was impossible. Terra itself seemed to conspire in his favor, subtly guiding events, bending perceptions, and stabilizing the currents. The custodians, silent and eternal, served with grim understanding. The Imperium's fate was being reshaped in the undercurrent of human insistence, and none could fully comprehend the scope of what was happening. The Inquisition's retreat was slow and measured. Strike teams fell back, their cohesion strained by psychic interference, miraculous phenomena, and the sheer weight of mass devotion. Even their leaders understood that brute force alone could not overcome the tide. Veynar's influence reached out, coiling around the battlefield, steadying the currents, ensuring the faithful remained unharmed even as chaos reigned. Across the hive, the faithful pressed forward, unbroken, unwavering, unstoppable. The city itself had become alive, a living conduit of human will and the warp, shaping reality and defying annihilation. Terra's central spires shivered beneath the weight of collective insistence. The faithful had converged from every hive, manufactorum, and spaceport, their numbers impossible to calculate, a living ocean pressing toward the heart of the Imperium. The air shimmered, thick with incense, ozone, and the subtle hum of warp currents. Light fractured through smoke, bending in impossible angles across spire tops, casting shifting auroras into the city's heart. Even the custodians, golden and unflinching, paused, sensing the enormity of what was about to unfold. At the foot of the Eternity Gate, Veynar Sol stood, frail yet impossibly focused, the currents of millions of prayers flowing through him like rivers of molten light. His mind strained under the weight of the impossible, the desire of humanity, the pressure of survival, the raw potency of faith made manifest. Each heartbeat echoed through the warp, synchronizing with the tidal insistence of the faithful. Round him, children, elders, priests, and scavengers formed a living conduit, their bodies, thoughts, and prayers shaping reality itself. The ground beneath their feet thrummed with a subtle vibration, as if Terra itself recognized the imperative of survival. In the upper reaches of the hive, Inquisitors realized the futility of conventional assault. Psychers, trained to manipulate and dominate the currents of the warp, faltered. Every attempt at psychic projection was subtly deflected, an illusion refracted by the lattice of devotion threading through the hive. Flames that should have engulfed the faithful fizzled harmlessly. Debris shifted to protect pilgrims, and wounds that should have been fatal healed with miraculous precision. The Inquisition's agents, disciplined and ruthless, hesitated, their doctrines clashing with undeniable manifest miracles. Rumors began to spread, even among the most loyal. The Emperor himself had touched this place, had moved among the faithful. Though each witness perceived him differently, some golden and radiant, some shadowed and unknowable, the custodians moved deliberately, forming a corridor of unyielding golden resolve around Veynar Sol. Halberds reflected the auroras twisting across the sky, creating a lattice of light that interacted with warp currents in subtle, incomprehensible ways. Each step they took seemed to stabilize the impossible phenomena occurring across the hive. Servitors paused mid-task. Astropaths fell to their knees, overcome by currents they could not parse. And even the most powerful psychers among the Inquisition felt their wills bent subtly by forces beyond comprehension. Veynar reached outward, threading guidance through the chaos, his frail body a nexus for currents that would have crushed any ordinary mind. The golden throne stirred. A subtle twitch, almost imperceptible, passed through the machinery of millennia, and a ripple of awareness radiated outward. Veynar felt it first as a hum beneath his feet, as though the pulse of Terra itself had aligned with the insistence of the faithful. The sacrificium, vocis, the millions gathered, felt it instinctively. Their chants swelled, a single harmonic resonance, unbroken, weaving a pattern across the warp. The hive trembled, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. The impossible had become inevitable. In the streets below, miracles intensified. Fires froze midair, streets reshaped themselves to protect pilgrims, debris formed bridges and passages where none should exist. Children walked across walls, adults carried the wounded without effort, and the faithful moved as one organism, guided by currents of devotion in the subtle hand of Veynar. Psychers, projecting fear, found their illusions twisted back upon themselves, their spells rebounding against currents they could not control. Even the most disciplined Inquisitors recognized that brute force would fail. Terra was no longer a city, it was a living conduit of human insistence and war potential, a manifestation of faith that defied destruction. Veynar's influence spread, subtle yet overwhelming. Each gesture of his hands, each flicker of his eyes, guided the currents of millions. The warp responded in kind, twisting perception, bending light, deflecting harm, amplifying miracles. A single wounded pilgrim recovered mid-step, their survival becoming a node in the lattice of insistence, reinforcing the tide. Entire districts seemed to pulse with life, their decay momentarily reversed, reshaped by the insistence of human will and the subtle movements of the warp. Children laughed, elders cried, priests chanted in harmonic resonance, and the currents of reality bent in acknowledgement of their insistence. From the spire tops, a psychic scream echoed, a tear in the veil of reality, subtle but undeniable, radiated across the hive. The faithful felt it as a call, an acknowledgement of their efforts, a stirring of something eternal. Even inquisitorial psychers faltered, unsure how to respond, their training inadequate against the tide of devotion amplified by a nexus so potent it defied comprehension. The city became a living stage for miracles. Fires that should have spread extinguished themselves. Rubble shifted to form safe passage. Wounds healed as if reality itself insisted upon survival. The custodians guided Veynar to the steps of the Golden Throne. The steps, worn by millennia of ritual, hummed beneath his feet. Servitors paused, ashpads trembled, and the city seemed to lean toward him, as though every brick, every spire, every soul recognized the nexus of fate now moving among them. Veynar extended his consciousness outward, threading the currents of the faithful into a lattice that encompassed the entire hive. Each heartbeat, each whispered prayer, each act of devotion became a tangible force, shaping reality and bending the impossible toward survival. The Golden Throne twitched again, more pronounced this time. Mechanical tendons shifted, lenses rotated, and a subtle pulse radiated outward, aligning with the lattice of human insistence. Lights danced across hive spires, auroras bending in harmony with psychic resonance, shadows receding, an impossible phenomena proliferating. Pilgrims fell to their knees, tears streaming, voices raised in unbroken chorus, a single harmonic resonance echoing through the warp. The custodians lowered halberds in silent acknowledgement, touting that obedience alone had been insufficient. The Imperium had been reshaped by insistence, by faith, by human will made manifest. Veynar felt the tide peak, a wave of energy so potent it threatened to overwhelm his frail body. The warp pulsed, reality bent, and the very essence of Terra seemed to align with the collective insistence of humanity. Bolterfire became irrelevant. Psyker illusions fractured. Demons waiting beyond the veil recoiled, and even the Inquisition hesitated, tamed, their doctrines insufficient to confront the tangible manifestation of devotion. Each miracle, each act of insistence, each life preserved, reinforced the lattice, solidifying a new reality where faith was not abstract, but tangible, unstoppable, and eternal. Finally, silence descended. The tide of miracles paused, frozen in a moment of awe. Terra itself seemed to exhale, acknowledging the culmination of insistence, the nexus of faith and will that had converged at the Golden Throne. Veynar, hollowed and radiant, stood at the epicenter, a living testament to the power of insistence. The custodians, golden and resolute, flanked him, their presence stabilizing the impossible manifestations across the hive. The faithful, million strong, fell to their knees, exhausted but triumphant, their insistence woven into the very fabric of reality. The Imperium had been irrevocably changed. Faith, once abstract, had become a tangible force, a power that could not be contained or suppressed. Custodians remained vigilant, the Inquisition silent, and the warp currents watched, patient and eternal. Veynar Sol, standing at the nexus of devotion and reality, understood the enormity of what had been achieved. The universe had listened. Something immense, eternal, incomprehensible had stirred, and Terra, cradle of mankind, bore witness to the dawn of a new epoch. Humanity's insistence had pierced the silence, reshaped fate, tamed, revealed the latent potential of devotion made manifest. And yet, Even as triumph settled over the spires and streets, a subtle tension lingered. The warp pulsed with quiet expectation.